Another Bendy and the Ink Machine theory? You betcha! Hey you prodigies, ProdCharles here. Chapter 3 of Bendy and the Ink Machine finally introduced us to Alice Angel, and boy was it a surprise! Alice Angel, who looked so sweet and innocent on her posters, now looks like a cartoon serial killer. But what are her true plans? In this theory, I share my thoughts on this situation. But before we begin, if you're new, remember to subscribe and tap that bell for more cool and interesting Bendy and horror game videos. And tap Add To and select Watch Later if you can't watch all the way through. Or just do it for fun. Let's start with what we know. We know that Alice Angel is hunting down perfect clones of the Butcher Gang and Boris for their hearts. We also know that Alice is seeking to perfect her own form. Alice appears to be unable to touch what she calls tainted ink. And finally, Alice gets Henry to perform multiple errands for her. Got all those facts? Now let's bring it all together. We know that Alice Angel is killing as many perfect 3D cartoons as possible. She does this to harvest their hearts, which she explains she does to make herself perfect. Alice is clearly obsessed with molding herself into the form that we see in the Alice Angel posters. But why and how? In Chapter 3, Alice mentions that she was born twice, once as a formless inky blob, and the second time as an angel. I think that to understand why and how Alice wants to become perfect, we need to understand the meaning behind her being born twice. When Alice was born a formless inky blob, she was clearly dissatisfied with her state. To get an idea of how this would have been like, we need to take a look at the table where we can find Sean Flynn's tape. It is likely that the blob that we can play with on this table is the closest evidence we can find to a blob that tries to take a certain form. Playing with this blob can transform it into several shapes, including some of the Bendy cartoon characters and the ink machine itself. In between each transformation, the ink becomes a wobbling blob. It's likely that Alice had taken this wobbling form and tried to make the same transformations as the blob by Sean Flynn's tape, but couldn't hold any of the forms as well. In the end, the blob would be rendered useless and recycled back into the ink used to form the 3D cartoons for a second round of rebirthing. All of the ink we've seen so far seems to make its way down to the bottom of the studio. In Chapter 3, we found that there's a huge area where the ink pools in level 14. If this is the final destination for most of the ink in the higher levels so far, then it would be easily recycled back through the ink pipes that extend from the massive ink well. And where do these ink pipes lead back to? That's right, the ink machine. Remember that Alice mentioned that being part of the ink is like being in a womb where bits of your mind float around like fish in a bowl. If most of the ink finds its way to the bottom of the studio, including Alice when she was a formless blob, only to be recycled back up to the ink machine again, then it makes sense that the inky womb would be the ink receptacle attached to the side of the machine. Of course, the metaphor could also apply just to being in an inky puddle, kind of like the pool of ink in level 14, but this ink would still find its way back up through the ink pipe network in the studio anyway. Given this, the ink container is the closest we have to the description that Alice gives us, which hints towards the purpose of the ink machine, to create 3D cartoons. This is interesting because it covers not only the why, but also the how of Alice Angel's quest for perfection. Let's start with the why. Alice Angel clearly saw her rebirth into the form she now takes as winning the lottery. She knows she has it good and doesn't want to return back to the inky abyss. However, Alice's body isn't a perfect representation of the Alice Angel that we can see on the Bendy posters, and certainly not how she would have looked on TV either. It's mangled and warped and falling apart. Other than plainly looking at Alice, we know this because she asks Henry to get several items in the game. One of these items is thick ink, which she says is disgusting, but perfect for keeping her body together. This confirms that Alice's body is not only mangled and warped, it isn't stable at all. It's falling apart. Henry also has to collect the hearts of the dead cartoons for Alice, which we know from the dialogue that we hear when we enter her chamber that she uses to make herself perfect. We also know this from the final mission that we have to perform for her at the end of the chapter. Now that we know that Alice Angel is doing this to keep her body from falling apart, as well as fixing her appearance, what about the how? Remember those hearts that Alice collects? These are the hearts of cartoons that have achieved perfection, the ones that beat all the odds and turned into a proper form. This highly suggests that Alice recycles these hearts to create more things, cartoons, inanimate objects, and body parts to repair herself. And she does this all with the ink machine. But not just any ink machine. After all, by Chapter 3, Alice should have just been able to continue doing this with the ink machine we repair in Chapter 1. No, she wants to use a second ink machine. When roaming along the staircase instead of using the elevator, it's possible to see a boarded up area in the wall with some gaps. Looking through these gaps, we can see an ink machine in storage. Provided that the ink machine actually can create new things in an inky form, it is highly likely that this was the ink machine that Alice uses to do it. Before explaining why, let's consider a couple of reasons for why she wouldn't want to use the first ink machine. Some prodigies have suggested that the first ink machine was the one that birthed Alice when she was a formless blob. This is possible because the second ink machine may have had a special design that was more effective at creating more perfect 3D cartoons. Remember that in Chapter 2, there were blueprints for an ink machine in Samuel Lawrence's office, and these blueprints suggest that the plans are for what is widely accepted as a Mark II of the ink machine, suggesting that there were improvements in this version. In Chapter 3, these plans also appear in the labs that we explore when doing Alice's missions, indicating that they had to be frequently referenced when the ink machine was in operation, and further supporting that a second, new and improved model of an ink machine was being used. Even if the ink machine wasn't an improved version, another case indicating that Alice wouldn't use the first ink machine is that Ink Bendy heavily guarded that area, and we can see that it had no little miracle stations to hide in. Alice has said in Chapter 3 that making contact with tainted ink could cause her to be dragged back into an inky womb, and as she fears Ink Bendy, it is highly likely that Bendy is the source of this tainted ink. Either that, or she's just scared that Bendy would rip her to shreds, because everyone and everything in the studio understands one major law: beware the ink demon. What do you think? I think that Alice does want to use this second ink machine to achieve perfection because of the other errands that she sends Henry out to perform. Among these errands include quests to collect gears and power cores. According to the CK2 blueprints, both of these items are required to turn on the ink machine. Along with the hearts of perfect cartoons and the thick ink, Alice would have all of the components needed to continue rolling the dice and get closer to fixing her imperfect form. Make sure to check out these videos, which were picked just for you. If you're new, tap my face to subscribe and tap that bell for more cool Bendy and horror game videos. And prodigies, I hope that these videos help you to expand on how you think, so it helps with your thinking in your daily lives. See ya!